Denial. Western historians of the USSR have accepted Khrushchev's supposed revelations as unproblematically true despite the fact that Khrushchev never gave any evidence for his charges against Stalin and in fact withheld evidence from party researchers who asked for it. The main evidentiary basis for conquest and for works by Khrushchev-sponsored writers including dissidents like Roi Medvedev and Alexander Nekrich, was the Khrushchev-era revelations. Western historians' accounts of the Stalin period continue to rely heavily on Khrushchev-era accounts. Vladimir L. Bobrov and I have studied the 10th chapter of Stephen F. Cohen's prize-winning book Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution. Cohen traces Bukharin's life from 1930 until his trial and execution in March 1938. He relied on Khrushchev-era sources that have all proven to be lies. Through the use of primary source evidence from former Soviet archives we show that every fact claim Cohen makes in this chapter that in any way alleges wrongdoing by Stalin is false. From the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the study of Soviet history has developed as an adjunct of political anti-communism. It has always had a dual character, that of discovering what happened, and that of defaming Stalin, the Soviet Union, and communism generally. The result is that academic historiography of the Soviet Union is rarely objective. It has sacred cows, tenets that are never questioned. This is the anti-Stalin paradigm. Academic historians of the USSR are pressured to conform to this paradigm, or at least not openly violate it. Chief among the tenets of the anti-Stalin paradigm is that all the Moscow trials, plus the Tukhachevsky affair, were frame-ups. Today, we know that this is false. An objective study of the evidence now available from former Soviet archives, from the Trotsky archives, and elsewhere, proves that these conspiracies did indeed exist. This false paradigm deprives academic historians and their readers of the ability to understand the conspiracy trials. It robs them and us of the ability to understand the context for the Yezhov-era mass repressions. The threat was real. Archival documents show that the Central Party leadership, Stalin and the Politburo, were constantly receiving very credible NKVD accounts of conspiracies, including transcripts of confessions and details of investigations. We also possess a number of accounts of these conspiracies from beyond the borders of the USSR. NKVD evidence of conspiracies sent to Stalin on July 2, 1937, shortly after the conclusion of the plenum. The Politburo, Stalin and those closest to him, issued the decree on anti-Soviet elements. For the next year or more, the Stalin leadership was flooded with reports of conspiracies and revolts from all over the USSR. Many of these have been published. Undoubtedly, a great many more remain unpublished. According to the N. Korstoff, an anti-Stalin researcher and editor of one of these collections, Stalin believed these reports. And the most frightening thing was that Stalin made his decisions on the basis of confessions that were the result of the inventions of certain employees of the organs of state security. Stalin's reactions attest to the fact that he took these confessions completely seriously. Here, Korstoff admits the existence of a major conspiracy by Yezhov and concedes that Stalin was deceived by him. Stalin acted in good faith on the basis of evidence presented to him by Yezhov, much of which may, or must, have been false. The lists Khrushchev, the vicious practice was condoned of having the NKVD prepare lists of persons whose cases were under the jurisdiction of the military collegium and whose sentences were prepared in advance. Yezhov would send these lists to Stalin personally for his approval of the proposed punishment. In 1937, 1938, 383 such lists containing the names of many thousands of party, Soviet, Komsomol, army and economic workers were sent to Stalin. He approved these lists. These lists have been published on the internet, where they are titled the Stalin shooting lists. Some writers dishonestly call them death warrants. Both are tendentious, inaccurate names, for these were not lists of persons to be shot at all. Following Khrushchev, the anti-Stalin editors of these lists do call the lists sentences prepared in advance. But their own research disproves this claim. In reality, these were lists sent to Stalin and other Secretariat members for review, rasmotrini, a word that is used many times in the introduction to the lists. The lists give the sentences that the NKVD recommended to the prosecution to seek if the individual were convicted, that is, the sentence the prosecution would ask the court to apply. Many people on these lists were not convicted at all or were convicted of a lesser offense and so not shot. The limits in the campaign against insurgents and conspirators. The Politburo set limits on the numbers of persons the party leaders and NKVD could execute and imprison. Order number 00447 established limits rather than quotas, maximums, not minimums. As we have seen, for years Stalin had been putting limits on mass executions by provincial leaders. If the Politburo had at this moment expected or wanted an open-ended terror, there would be no reason to call them limits at all. The word's meaning was well known, it never meant quotas. Reflecting Stalin's concern that locals might go out of control, Order number 00447 twice warned that excesses in local implementation of the operation were not permitted. Getty also emphasizes this fact in a recent book. One of the mysteries of the field is how limity is routinely translated as quotas. One writer who constantly translates limity as quotas is Oleg Klevnuk. Another is Timothy Snyder. It seems that anti-communist writers want Stalin to have called for quotas so that he appears dishonest and cruel. Contested elections to the Soviets are cancelled. The Central Committee plenum of October 1937 saw the final cancellation of the plan for contested elections to the Soviets. This represented a serious defeat for Stalin and his supporters in the Politburo. A sample ballot, showing several candidates, had already been drawn up. The Soviet elections of December 1937 were implemented on the basis that the party candidates would run on slates with 20–25% of non-party candidates, an alliance of sorts, but without a contest. Originally the elections were planned without slates, with voting only for individuals, a far more democratic method in that candidates would not get votes simply by being on the ticket. Yakovlev had been one of those closest to Stalin in drafting the 1936 constitution to which Stalin was so committed. Along with A.I. Stetsky and B.M. Tal, Yakovlev was a member of the small commission that worked on the text of the constitution. The commission had presented a rough draft to Stalin in February 1936, the draft that Stalin referred to in his celebrated talk with Roy Howard on March 1. But on October 10, all the members of the Politburo and Secretariat met in Stalin's office. The meeting ended at 10 p.m., after approving the main points of Molotov's presentation at the opening session of the Cece Plenum, to be held the next day. The second point of Molotov's presentation was contested candidates. Contested elections were effectively ruled out, since no one expected the regional party leaders, the first secretaries, to permit them unless they were required to do so. Point 3 of Molotov's outline reads, non-party members, 20–25%. What happened? Zhukov concludes that there was simply no majority in the Politburo, let alone the Central Committee, in support of contested elections, and a strong insistence on guaranteeing that the party, which meant the regional party leaders, would dominate the Soviets. Clearly, Stalin was no dictator. He did not get what he had fought hard for. Yakovlev's arrest and confession. The Saratov Oblast Party organization had distrusted Yakovlev, who had been a Trotskyist in 1923. Stalin had stood firmly by him. But on October 12, the day after the opening of the Cece Plenum, Yakovlev was arrested. 2 days later he confessed to having been a clandestine Trotskyist sleeper since 1923. An even greater shock was the fact that Yakovlev also confessed to having been recruited by a German agent who told him that they, the Germans, were in contact with Trotsky and wished to work with Yakovlev on the same terms. Yakovlev's confession is arguably one of the most important documents from the former Soviet archives published in recent years. That no doubt explains why it is virtually never mentioned, let alone studied, by mainstream historians of the USSR. Yakovlev inculpated as conspirators a number of leading Soviet figures. In a few cases, we also have one or more confessions that confirm Yakovlev's confession. Party and trade union elections. Although contested elections were not held for the Soviets, they were held for party and trade union positions. Stalin did indeed have democratic intentions. Relying on the rank and file to vote out local leaders, if they chose to do so, is one of the things democracy is all about. The forces that were powerful enough to defeat Stalin's struggle for democratic, contested elections to the Soviets had not been powerful enough to stop democratic elections in the party and the trade unions. During the second half of 1937, the unprecedented democratic trade union elections were in fact conducted. But they did not happen again. The mass repressions are stopped. Accounts of the repressions of 1937, 1938 by mainstream historians are useful insofar as they document how the repressions proceeded. By surveying the large number of primary sources now available, these accounts show how Stalin and the top party leadership gradually came to understand what was happening. What they had been assured was a battle against counter-revolutionary conspiracies had in fact very often been directed against loyal party members and completely innocent citizens. Mainstream historians do not discuss the most important sets of documentary evidence that bear directly on the causes, course, and conclusion of the Yezhov mass repressions, the conspiracies that we know existed. This includes all those that were the subject of the 3 Moscow trials plus the conspiracy of military commanders and other officers that is often referred to simply as the Tukhachevsky affair. These conspiracies provided the impetus for the resolutions of early July 1937 concerning the need to use massive force. The investigation documents detailing the confessions of alleged conspirators and the conclusions of NKVD investigators with which Yezhov bombarded Stalin and the Central Party leadership for more than a year after the June 1937 Cece Plenum. Dozens of these reports, often very long and detailed, have been published. Yakov Yakovlev's confession is one of them. Only a few have been translated into English. We do not know how much more documentation Stalin received. This is probably just a fraction of it. The confession of Yezhov's assistant Mikhail Frinovsky and Yezhov's many confessions of 1939. These are entirely ignored. The few remarks mainstream historians make about this material shows that they prefer to not believe it. This is the fallacy of begging the question, assuming that which is to be proven. It is illegitimate for historians to ignore evidence simply because that evidence is not consistent with some preconceived paradigm of what must have happened. These confessions dismantle the anti-Stalin paradigm. Mainstream scholarship ignores all the evidence that explains the reason for the mass repression of the Yezhov era. Then, these scholars declare that the reason for these repressions is a mystery. Naturally, if one decides in advance to ignore the evidence, then the events are indeed inexplicable. November 1938, orders to stop all mass repressions. We have a little documentation about early suspicion by the Politburo against the NKVD itself. In early 1938, the Central Committee sent Shkiriatov to Ordzhonikidze to investigate evidence that had come through about criminal perversions during the mass operations committed by regional NKVD organs. Suspicions continued to grow in the Politburo that massive, unauthorized repressions were going on. In August 1938, Yezhov's second-in-command, Mikhail Frinovsky, was replaced by Lavrentiy Beria. Beria was chosen as a reliable person to keep watch over Yezhov, as Yezhov himself later stated. By the time of the October 1937, Cece Plenum, Stalin and the Politburo had begun to uncover evidence of massive illegal repression. On November 15, 1938, the hearing of cases by troikas was stopped, along with military tribunals and the military collegium of the Supreme Court. On December 8, the press announced that he had been relieved of his duties as head of the NKVD at his own request. 4 days later, the Moscow Regional Court reversed the first of many convictions of former enemies. The declaration noted that the Supreme Court had not only released 5 construction engineers but had recognized that the 5 had actually tried to thwart real enemies. Yezhov's conspiracy gradually uncovered, legality is reintroduced under Beria, November 1938. Once Yezhov had resigned, to be replaced by Beria, orders were issued to immediately stop all the repressions, to repeal all the NKVD operational orders that enabled them, and to re-emphasize the need for oversight by the prosecutor's office of all cases of arrest. Then there began a flood of reports to Beria and the Central Party leadership concerning massive illegitimate repressions and shootings on the part of local NKVD groups. The Central Party leadership began to investigate. On January 29, 1939, Politburo members Beria, Andrei Andreev, and Georgy Molenkov signed a report detailing massive crimes during Yezhov's tenure. This important evidence that the mass repression was Yezhov's, not Stalin's, doing was only published in 2008. During the next few years, further investigations and prosecutions of guilty NKVD men proceeded. According to the editors of a major document collection, in 1939 the NKVD arrested more than 44,000 persons, about 1/15 of the number arrested in 1938. Most of these arrests were in western Ukraine and Belorussia. During the same year about 110,000 persons were freed after the review of cases of those arrested in 1937, 1938. On October 28, 1939, a group of prosecutors wrote to Andrei Zhdanov to ask him to intercede with the Central Committee about the slowness of the NKVD in reviewing cases of persons innocently imprisoned. It would seem that the party's Central Committee decision of November 17, 1938, should have mobilized all attention on immediately rectifying the criminal policy of the bastard Yezhov and his criminal clique, which has literally terrorized Soviet persons, upright, dedicated citizens, old party members, and entire party organizations. 10. Yezhov's confessions. Yezhov's own confessions are evidence that Stalin and the Central Soviet leadership were not responsible for his massive executions. Yezhov explicitly states many times that his repressions and executions were carried out in pursuit of his own private conspiratorial goals. In his confession of August 4, 1939, Yezhov admitted, "We were deceiving the government in the most blatant manner." 11. There is no evidence that these confessions represent anything but what Yezhov chose to say. No evidence of torture, threats, or fabrication. Ideologically, anti-communist accounts suppress the evidence of Yezhov's conspiracy against the Soviet government. The apparent reason is the desire to falsely accuse Stalin of having ordered all the huge number of executions carried out by Yezhov. Frinevsky's statement. In his statement to Beria of April 11, 1939, Mikhail Frinevsky, Yezhov's second-in-command, explicitly confirms the guilt of the defendants in the Moscow trials. 12. Frinevsky is explicit that Yezhov did not force Bukharin and others to falsely confess. Instead, Yezhov asked them not to name him, Yezhov, as one of the rightist conspirators, and Bukharin and the others did not. We have a great deal of other evidence that Bukharin was guilty. This evidence also serves as confirmation of Frinevsky's statement. Yezhov was arrested on April 10, 1939. According to Yezhov, the idea of an NKVD conspiracy was first suggested to him by German military attaché General Ernst K. Ostring. After the Tukhachevsky affair trial and executions, Marshal Egorov and the Germans reconsidered this original plan, which was oriented towards aiding an invasion of the USSR by Germany and or allies. With the top figures in the military conspiracy now removed, the Germans suggested a coup d'état instead. Aside from the Moscow trials and Tukhachevsky affair defendants, of whose guilt we can be sure, we do not know whom Yezhov specifically targeted. We would like to know how many of the Central Committee members and other well-known persons such as intellectuals and military officers of lesser rank who were tried and executed during 1937-1938 were in fact guilty. Likewise, the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Soviet citizens. The main reason we do not know more about this is that no one is asking this question and doing the research. A huge number of persons have been rehabilitated, declared innocent. But the rehabilitation process is political and judicial, not historical. We have shown that many of the well-known figures who have been rehabilitated were in fact guilty, declared innocent under Khrushchev and Gorbachev out of political expediency alone. At the end of Yezhov's interrogation of August 4, 1939, the interrogator raises the fact that the NKVD also controlled the Gulag, the labor camps where those not sentenced to execution were confined. Accounts of the Gulag agree that conditions in the camps were bad during 1937, 1938 and improved immediately on Beria's taking over the NKVD from Yezhov. Yezhov's account here explains this. Yevgenia Ginsburg, who was in Yaroslavl prison and who saw no newspapers, said that the prisoners could tell when Yezhov fell. The draconian regime in the prisons was relaxed one day. The timing was confirmed a few days later when Beria's name began to appear on official prison notices. Conclusion: Great Terror is a misleading name, but not because no one was frightened. It is misnamed because Conquest invented the term Great Terror to mean Stalin's purge of the 30s, and it was no such thing. The falsehood is located not in the assertion that there was terror but in the claim as to who the terrorists were. Yezhov picked a great many of his victims at random, a process that must have sparked fear. But the Soviet population was not ruled by terror and the Soviet population generally was not terrorized. The term Great Terror is false in the way in which Conquest used it, and in the way it continues to be used in the field of Soviet history. Yezhov's mass repressions were a continuation of the conspiracies described at the 3 Moscow trials and the Tukhachevsky affair. Yezhov initiated his own NKVD conspiracy, the mass murders, after the military conspiracy had been discovered and, in the main, destroyed. A great many innocent persons had been murdered. From 1939 into the war years, Beria, as head of the NKVD, and the Soviet Procuracy reviewed hundreds of thousands of cases and released hundreds of thousands of persons whom they judged had been wrongly imprisoned. At the same time, they continued to investigate, uncover, and punish persons who really were involved in anti-Soviet conspiracies. Real conspiracies did exist. Yezhov's and Frinevsky's confessions make it clear that not everyone repressed under Yagoda and Yezhov was innocent. Soviet émigrés like Grigory Takiv and Svetlana Lihachev testify to the fact that some conspirators were never identified. 13 The evidence we now have supports 2 hypotheses. First, that many first secretaries and other party leaders were involved in the right Trotskyist conspiracy. Second, that some of them were also directly involved with Yezhov's NKVD conspiracy. It is confirmed by the convergence of a great many individual pieces of evidence. It is also utterly incompatible with mainstream Soviet historiography, which demands that Stalin be the mass murderer and Yezhov his loyal executioner. For this reason, it is rejected by mainstream anti-communist Soviet historians and by Trotskyists. It does not fit the Procrustean bed of the anti-Stalin paradigm. Grover Furr has written many books on Soviet history of the Stalin period, most recently Trotsky's Amalgams, Trotsky's Lies, The Moscow Trials as Evidence, The Dewey Commission, Trotsky's Conspiracies of the 1930s, Volume 1 and Yezhov vs. Stalin, The Truth About Mass Repressions and the So-Called Great Terror in the USSR, as well as many articles. His homepage may be accessed at He is a professor of medieval literature in the English department at Montclair State University in New Jersey. Notes 1. Its official name was All Union Communist Party. 2. By democratic here we mean consistent with social democratic, that is, capitalist, notions of democracy. 3. Online at a slightly different translation is in Getty and Naumoff, Doc. 169, 470, 471. 4, 5, 6. At least one copy of such a ballot has survived in an archive. Zhukov has included a photograph of it in Inouye, 6th illustration. I have put it online at 7. For more on the dictator question see, Wheatcroft, S. G. 2007. Agency and Terror, Yevdokimov and Mass Killing in Stalin's Great Terror. Australian Journal of Politics and History 5320, 43. 8. For these texts in Russian and English see my article The Moscow Trials and the Great Terror of 1937-1938, What the Evidence Shows, at 9. Russian text online at English translation at 10. Online at English translation at 13. In the early 1980s, I tried to verify this account by writing to persons who had known Yezhov. Professor Nikolai Andreev, of Cambridge University, wrote me 2 letters telling me of his close friendship with Yezhov's Svetlana and Frolov, of how highly he thought of his trustworthiness. References Bruy, p. 1980. Trotsky et le Bloc des Oppositions de 1932. Cahiers Leon Trotsky 5-5, 37. Constitution of 1936, in Russian, in English. Frinovsky, M. P. 2006. To the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs of the Union of Soviet Soc Republics Commissar of State Security First Degree Beryl P. Lubyanka 1939, 1946-33, 60. Russian original at https, English translation at ML Furr, G. 2005. Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform. Cultural Logic. And, 2009. Evidence of Leon Trotsky's collaboration with Germany and Japan. Cultural Logic. 2011. Khrushchev lied. The evidence that every revelation of Stalin's crimes in Nikita Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25, 1956, is provably false. Kettering, Ohio, Erythros Press and Media LLC. 2013. The Murder of Sergei Kirov. History, Scholarship and the Anti-Stalin Paradigm. Kettering, Ohio, Erythros Press and Media LLC. 2015. Trotsky's Amalgams, Trotsky's Lies, The Moscow Trials as Evidence, The Dewey Commission. Trotsky's Conspiracies of the 1930s. Volume 1. Kettering, Ohio, Erythros Press and Media, LLC. 2016. Yezhov vs. Stalin, The Truth About Mass Repressions and the So-Called Great Terror in the USSR. Kettering, Erythros Press and Media, LLC. The Moscow Trials and the Great Terror of 1937-1938, What the Evidence Shows. Furr, G., and V. L. Bobrov. 2010. Stephen Cohen's Biography of Bukharin, A Study in the Falsehood of Khrushchev-era Revelations. Cultural Logic. Genrikh Yagoda. 1997. Narkom vnutrenik del SSSR, Generalny Komissa Gosударственной Безопасности. Kazan, Zbornik Dokumentov. Getty, J. A. 1985. Origins of the Great Purges. The Soviet Communist Party Reconsidered, 1933-1938. New York and Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. 2002. Excesses are not permitted, Mass Terror and Stalinist Governance in the Late 1930s. The Russian Review 61-113, 38. 2013a. The Rise and Fall of a Party First Secretary, Vainov of Yaroslavl. In the Anatomy of Terror, Political Violence Under Stalin, ed. J. Harris, 66, 84. Oxford Scholarship Online. 2013 b. Practicing Stalinism. Bolsheviks, Boyars, and the Persistence of Tradition. New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University Press. Pre-election fever, The Origins of the 1937 Mass Operations. Harris Anatomy 216, 235. Getty, J. A., and O. V. Naumoff. 1999. The Road to Terror. Stalin and the Self-Destruction of the Bolsheviks, 1932, 1939. New Haven, Yale University Press. Goldman, W. Z. 2007. Terror and Democracy in the Age of Stalin. The Social Dynamics of Repression. New York, Cambridge University Press. Harris, J. ed. 2013. The Anatomy of Terror. Political Violence Under Stalin. New York, Oxford University Press. Jansen, M., and N. Petrov. 2002. Stalin's Loyal Executioner. People's Commissar Nikolai Yezhov 1895-1940. Stanford, Hoover Institution Press. Korstov, V. N. 2011. Lubyanka. Sovtskaya Elitna Stalinskoy Golgov. 1937-1938. Dokumenty. Moscow, Metzdyu Narodny Fond Demokratia, 2011. 2004. Lubyanka. Stalin I Glavno Upravlenie Gosbezopasnosti NKVD. 1937-1938. Moscow, Materik, 2004. 2006. Lubyanka. Stalin I NKVD NKGB Guksmersh. 1939, Mart 1946. Moscow, MDF, 2006. Korstov, V. and L. Samuelson. 2009. NKVD I Represii 1936-1938 GG. Historia Stalinisma Series. Moscow, Rospin. Khrushchev, N. S. 1962. The New Leader. The Crimes of the Stalin Era. Introduction by Anatol Shub. Notes by Boris Nikolaevsky. New York, The New Leader. Koanka, D. P., and R. D. Bachman, eds. 1997. Revelations from the Russian Archives. Documents in English translation. Washington, D.C., Library of Congress. Petrov, N., and M. I. Jansen. 2008. Stalinsky Epitomets, Nikolai Yezhov. Moscow, Rospin. Report of Court Proceedings. The Case of the Trotskyite Zinovyevite Terrorist Center. Moscow, People's Commissariat of Justice of the USSR 1936. Report of Court Proceedings in the Case of the Anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center. Heard before the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR Moscow, January 23, 30, 1937. Verbatim Report. Moscow, People's Commissariat of Justice of the USSR 1937. Stalin, J. V. 1936a. The Stalin-Howard Interview. N.Y., International Publishers. 1936b. On the Draft of the Constitution of the USSR. Collected Works, Volume 14. http, Grochev 62. Problems of Leninism, 795, 834. Peking, Foreign Languages Press. 1937. Vystupliny Stalina na Rasherenem Zasadani Ivo Inogo Savita Prinarko Moboroni Istaknik 372, 88. A slightly different version is in Lubyanka 1937, 1938, 202, 209. To Kiev, G. 1956. Comrade X London, Harville Press. Wheatcroft, S. G. 2004. From Team Stalin to Degenerate Tyranny. In the Nature of Stalin's Dictatorship. The Politburo, 1924, 1953, ed. E. A. Rees, 79, 107. Basingstoke, Palgrave Macmillan. 2007. Agency and Terror, Yevdokimov and Mass Killing in Stalin's Great Terror. Australian Journal of Politics and History 5320, 43. Zhukov, I. 2002a. Skupil Stalina, Komsomolskaya Pravda, November 5, 6, 12,13, 14, 15, 19, 20. 2002b. Repressi II Constitutio SSSR 1936 Goda. Voprosi Story. 1-3, 26. 2000. Tany Kremlia, Stalin, Molotov, Beria, Molenkov, Moscow, Terranichny Club. 2003. Inoy Stalin. Politicheski Reformy vs SSRV 1933, 1937 GG. Moscow, Vagrius. 348.